9:45, so it's probably a good time to get started, everybody. Unfortunately, Ned Watts from Michigan State couldn't be here today, so I'm stepping in to chair this panel, Regional and Rural Identities in the Midwest. We'll begin with a presentation titled Defining Success on the Great Plains, an Individual Interpretation. The author is Brandon Duxbury, currently a graduate student in history at Iowa State University. Brandon completed his bachelor's degree in history at Northern State University in South Dakota and his master's in geoenvironmental science at Shippensburg University in Pennsylvania. I'll turn things over to Brandon.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Thanks for showing up today. I'll start by saying this is part of my thesis that I'm currently working on and almost finished with, just looking at individual agency during the homesteading era in the Dakota Territory. So with that, I'll just get right into this. So too often, the success and failure of 19th century settlers on the Great Plains is determined by broad definitions created by 20th and 21st century historians. The common definition of success is in terms of persistence. If a settler moved west and stayed long enough for their names to appear on two separate census rolls, they were considered a success. John Mack Farragher suggested that settlers who did not persist in one area tended to move further west in search of success or return east in defeat. Closely associated with persistence is accumulation of land and wealth. Robert Ostergren argued that most migrants came to better their prospects and placed pecuniary advantage above all else. Those who persisted tended to establish profitable farms or businesses. These definitions, however, tend to downplay the role culture, family, preconceived notions, and expectations played in the individual's own conceptions of success and failure. Both are relative terms unique to each individual. They are also fluid. Once settlers met certain goals or deemed them unattainable, they set new goals and thus redefined what success and failure meant to them. Consequently, historians should tread carefully when imposing broad definitions of the terms on all settlers who moved west. Instead, we should take into account individuals to determine what they considered success. Doing so will give us a more complex but more accurate understanding of why settlers chose to stay put or move on during the era of westward expansion. To provide just one example, I will present the story of Wesley Hunt, a unique individual who settled in the Dakota Territory. His account both supports and challenges certain historical generalizations of the 19th century homesteading experience. Wesley Hunt was a well-established member of his North Charlestown, New Hampshire community. At an early age, he helped his father with raising livestock and growing crops on the family farm. For 2 years after his graduation from a prestigious school, he worked at numerous jobs before starting full-time as station agent for the Vermont Central Railroad, where he received a monthly salary of $22.50, along with rent-free living quarters above the station. Hunt also served as an agent for the American Express Company, for which he earned $3 every month, and as North Charlestown's postmaster, which came with an annual salary of $180. With a combined yearly salary of nearly $500, Hunt had become a prominent and well-respected member of his community. A series of unfortunate and traumatic events occurred between 1875 and 1883, however. Wesley's wife, Ida, gave birth to their first child in April 1875. Both Ida and the child, Esther, were severely ill afterwards. Ida recovered, Esther did not. She died in September of that year. 1 year later, Ida's father passed away unexpectedly. Ida committed suicide soon after. A year later, Wesley married Rosie Bailey. Their first and only child was born in 1880. To increase his income, Hunt rented out an old shoe factory for $50 a year and stocked it with groceries, hardware, clothing, and dry goods. Business went well for 2 years until an arsonist targeted Hunt's store. The fire destroyed nearly everything. The loss of his store threatened Hunt's ability to provide for his family. Even though he recouped his losses through insurance payments, the incident devastated him. Just 1 month after the fire, Wesley Hunt made plans to homestead in the Dakota Territory. The idea was not a new one in his family. Wesley's father had considered moving west in 1867, but had decided against it. Wesley's cousin had already homesteaded near Huron, Dakota Territory. But not until another tragedy struck the family did Hunt decide to make the move. Susan Bailey, Rosie's older sister, passed away. Soon after, Susan's husband, Frank Ayer, and his son, George, decided to take their chances at homesteading in the Dakota Territory. With family already located there and more family on their way, Hunt decided that that was his best chance to escape the negative experiences of his recent past. His father, Rosie, and the railroad company reluctantly agreed to let him leave for the summer on the stipulation that he return in the fall. On March 10th, only 3 weeks after the fire, Hunt began making plans for the journey. His mood immediately improved as he imagined the success he was about to find in the Dakota Territory. An ambitious, spontaneous man, Hunt set high expectations for his western expedition. Anything less than earning a fortune would be a failure. Hunt left for the Dakota Territory on April 3rd, 1883. After a brief stop in Chicago, he boarded a train with people all bound for Dakota. He arrived safely in Iroquois, Dakota Territory on April 6th. He explored the area and found what he called a good deal of good soil, the finest land in the world, but did not find any open land to purchase. He continued on to Huron, a town 10 miles further to the west. Within a day, he purchased 2 mules for $325, taking a $225 loan from the bank, and began working for his cousin for $4 per day. Hunt only stayed in Huron for 6 days before moving another 45 miles west to Miller. Once there, he found what he had dreamed of, 5 quarter sections which he secured preemption claims on. 1 for himself, 1 each for Frank and George Ayer, and 2 more for other family members who he believed would follow him. Over the next few days, Hunt made multiple purchases, including a pair of horses, a stove, and coal. He also paid $7 to have lumber delivered to his homestead to construct his shelter. Having the money readily available, Hunt acquired the necessary supplies for his homestead much quicker than many other Dakota settlers. In a letter to his father, Wesley Hunt clarified what his intentions and expectations were for his life in the Dakota Territory. He planned to purchase 50 cows from a man in Iowa, keep them for 4 years, and then return 100 head to Iowa as payment. Hunt's plan was an optimistic one. If he were to succeed in raising 50 head of livestock, he needed to grow crops his very first year while finding enough grassland in the nearby hills to graze his cattle on during the summer, but also cut for hay to feed the cattle during the winter. The plan could only work if he maintained control of the 2 quarter sections he was holding for his family members. As a result, Hunt desperately tried to convince his father to follow him to the Dakota Territory. He described the land as as fine land as lies in Dakota, or the world either for that matter, and there is no shadow of a contest about it. He went on to predict that in 4 years, he would have 200 or 300 young cattle, besides what butter they produced. He continued, "Of course I am very anxious to go into it. It will give me such a boom in 3 or 4 years as you can easily figure." All he needed was the money to purchase the machinery, tools, and feed he required. He figured he had enough to get started, but he wanted to build barns and fences and purchase plows and horses immediately. The quicker he could get the cattle and begin raising them on his homestead, the quicker he would experience his boom. He quickly ran out of money and asked his father for $400 or $500 to get started. He ended his letter by explaining that his immediate success in the Dakota Territory depended on his father's help. He wrote that if he did not receive the money, he would try and pull through somehow, only it will take longer. For Hunt, short-term profit was the goal. But short-term profit in the cattle business eluded him. He failed to convince his father and wife to join him in the Dakota Territory, and therefore altered his plan. He still intended to succeed in his farming venture, but decided cattle was no longer the appropriate means to do so. Hunt instead chose to become a hog producer. He wrote that, "We are going to sow a lot of turnip seed to raise for feeding hogs. If our crops turn out well, we intend to buy a lot of sows. George will stay and take care of them this winter, and probably his father too. There is money in hogs." Hunt's father remained adamant that he would stay in New Hampshire, which dampened Wesley's optimism. Even though Hunt planted crops, his ranching dreams, whether hogs or cattle, never materialized. He also began to realize he was overly ambitious and should have worked more slowly toward achieving his goals. He wrote to his father in July that his cousin was raising hogs, but that he has to buy a good deal of feed for them. It pays better to work into stock slowly as one can handle them. Rather than adapting his goals to this realization, he viewed his time in the Dakota Territory as a failure. Plan after ill-devised plan, he failed to gain the support of his family and friends. He dreamed too big and often overlooked the reality of his situation. Even though he plowed more land and produced more crops than most settlers could hope for during their first year in the Dakota Territory, he failed to achieve the goals he set. He never purchased 100 head of cattle, he never owned a passel of hogs, he never convinced his wife or father to join him on the homestead. Hunt forced himself to reevaluate his goals and decide where he was most likely to find success. A prominent career and his loved ones awaited him in the East. Only dreams that continually failed to materialize kept him in the West. Even though he put himself in a position to thrive by November, Hunt realized that his optimistic dreams would not come to fruition. His father mailed him a check for $60, which allowed him to pay off the initial loan he took out when he moved to the Dakota Territory. On December 1st, Hunt proved up on his claim and then took the train to Huron, where he paid for his land and received the ownership papers. Once again, Hunt found himself on the move, this time back to New Hampshire, where success surely awaited him. He arrived in North Charlestown, New Hampshire on December 6th, where he reunited with Rosie and his father. He sold and deeded his property to James Perry, his sister's husband, for $900. Hunt regained his position as station agent and postmaster and never returned to his homestead in the Dakota Territory. Wesley Hunt's attempt to homestead in the Great Plains both supports and challenges certain historical assumptions. If historians choose persistence as a measure of success, Hunt certainly failed. By only staying on his homestead for 7 months in 1883, his name did not appear on a single census record, much less the 2 required by historians to be considered a persister. In this aspect, Hunt supports those traditional arguments of persistence and success. He did not stay, therefore he failed. But his story sheds light on the weaknesses of this approach. If historians only look for names that appear on 2 separate census rolls for the same place, Hunt would not have been seen at all. The late 18th century was a period of high mobility. People were constantly on the move in search of new opportunities to succeed. If they did not find it, they often continued moving. Settlers such as Hunt, who came and left between census years, fall through the cracks when simplified methods of studying persistence and success are used. For historians who use land and wealth accumulation, however, Hunt would have been considered a success, or at least well on his way to owning and operating a successful homestead. He planted and harvested enough crops to sell on the market and feed livestock during his first year in the Dakota Territory, something most settlers could only dream of doing. Having the capital to immediately purchase tools, seed, machinery, and supplies surely gave him an advantage over other settlers. Even though he did not make money that year, he also did not go into crippling debts. But by the time he chose to move back to New Hampshire, Hunt owned outright 160 acres of land and likely had the opportunity to purchase land from Frank and George Ayer. He had set himself up for future land acquisition and wealth accumulation. Had he stayed, he may have been one of the success stories from the era, but Hunt merely broke even in terms of capital. Factoring in how much he accomplished during the short amount of time he spent on his homestead, Hunt should be considered a success. In Hunt's mind, however, he had failed. He traveled to the Dakota Territory with optimistic plans of getting rich. He had the farm experience, he had the capital to invest, and he attained the land he needed to succeed in his goals. Those plans never materialized how he dreamed they would. He failed in convincing his father and wife to join him, which led to his failure in gaining enough land to run a large cattle operation. But he remained optimistic. Hogs required less land for grazing, land which he could devote to growing crops. He had used up his savings to invest in land and necessary implements, leaving him with little money to purchase the hogs. Had he sold his crops on the market, he may have had enough the following year to invest in the animals. But waiting was not an option for Hunt. He needed to succeed quickly. In his mind, success did not come quick enough. He moved back to the security of family and steady employment in New Hampshire, never achieving his goals. Hunt's decision to leave the Dakota Territory is one that historians often overlook because it does not fit nicely into the predetermined definitions they use to study success. Looking at how Hunt, as well as other settlers, define success and failure for themselves will create new questions for historians to study. Doing so will create a more complicated but more accurate understanding of the homestead era. And I just want to end on a disclaimer that there are some weaknesses in looking at just the individuals, because how can we study every individual? And the simple answer is we can't. But I'm proposing this that a lot of times we start labeling people and putting them in boxes, and we forget that they're individuals, they're very complex, they have a lot of different labels and wear a lot of different hats. And so we need to remember that they're complex, they're internalizing external pressures in very different ways and making their own decisions based on that. And so we need to remember that these individuals are making their own decisions, and how they come up with their terms of success and failure are unique to themselves, and they might not match up with other individuals in their same situations. So with that, I will look forward to questions a little later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brandon. Our second presentation on the panel is titled A Perfect Community, When the Agricultural History You Write About is Your Own. It will be given by Zachary Michael Jack. Dr. Jack is a board member of the Midwestern History Association and the author of many books on agriculture, conservation, and environmental history. An associate professor of English at North Central College in Naperville, Illinois, Jack teaches courses in writing, leadership, and place studies. Most recently, his popular book of agricultural history, Liberty Hyde Bailey, Essential Agrarian and Environmental Writings, was reissued in paperback for fall 2016 by Cornell University Press. A frequent contributor of op-eds and commentaries on rural and regional issues, Jack is the seventh generation in his family to make his home on a Midwestern farm. He's presented at the Newberry Library Seminar in Agriculture and the annual meeting of the Agricultural History Society, among other venues. Welcome, Zach.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to be here, and really a conference that I love. I've made it. I like how we're titling it Lost Region 1, 2, and 3 now. I was saying it's like an epic, sequel or something. And I was at 1, and I'm at 3, but I did miss 2. But it's a great group to be a part of for reasons that I hope to talk a little bit about today. So yeah, the topic is exactly that. What to do when the history you're writing about is also your own. And of course that puts a conventional historian in sort of a bind, because we're often taught not to write about ourselves, our lives. In the minute we do, people don't know necessarily what to call us. Are we if we include interviews, are we a journalist? If we transcribe at length the words of others, are we an oral historian? If we're sharing family stories, does that make us not a historian but a memoirist? And what's the difference between a memoirist who writes from historical artifact almost exclusively and a historian? So it's an interesting bind to find oneself in, and I suppose when it comes to writing agricultural history, I'm lucky in that I have a rich history to draw from with my family. But I would argue that most of us as historians have a history or a series of histories that are relevant to our body of work as scholars. And so then the question becomes, what do we do? Do we decide not to include that history for the sake of supposed legitimacy or objectivity? Or is it to what point is it dishonest not to include one's own history? So that's really kind of the question that I wanted to raise today, and have written some thoughts. This is sort of brand new, so I'll probably stumble here and there. Forgive me on that. But again, this has come up for me a number of times recently. So I've written 3 books of history over the last several years that this has come into play in different ways. So most recently I wrote a book of history for young adults, scholarly history for young adults, ages 14 to 18, called March of the Suffragettes. And it's about an early Votes for Women march that went from Manhattan to Albany, New York, in the 1912, end of 1912. It was led by a suffragette named Rosalie Gardner Jones. Well, in that instance, I decided not to include any of my own personal, familial, community history. It would seem like a stretch to include anything but a brief preface. I didn't really have, my family, I could have, I suppose. My family hails originally, before we went to Iowa in the 1850s, we were from, in that classic Yankee pattern, we were from upstate New York, from the Watertown, Syracuse area. I still have family there today. My sister is still there in Syracuse. So in that sense, I guess if I had wanted to make a personal connection to Rosalie Gardner Jones and that suffrage hike of 1912 from Manhattan to Albany, I certainly could have in that particular way. I could have pointed out that I come from a place, Iowa, where we are known kind of worldwide for our odysseys, our treks, our vision quests of various kinds. And there I would cite not only the Mormon trek, right, from Nauvoo all the way to Utah, across Iowa. I would cite also the first transcontinental road going through Iowa, the Lincoln Highway, Highway 30. I would cite Interstate 80, which parallels Highway 30, the Lincoln Highway, and goes all the way across country. I would cite RAGBRAI, which is the famous bike race across. I mean, for one reason or another, Iowa is sort of synonymous with people moving across it, I suppose, from coast to coast, from Mississippi to Missouri. And of course, we're known as sort of quintessential flyover country for that same sort of reason, that people always seem to be crisscrossing us, but not necessarily staying. Well, the fact that Rosalie Gardner Jones was on an odyssey, a kind of cross-state trek, I could certainly have linked to my own experience as an Iowan. All that, you can probably tell, feels a little bit of a stretch. So I ultimately decided not to include any of my personal, familial, or New York history in that book. 2, though, that I did, I wrote a book a few years ago called The Midwest Farmer's Daughter in Search of an American Icon. Now, in that instance, it felt dishonest to me, coming from 7 generations of Midwest farmers' daughters, not to include my own experience, and more than that, the experience of the women in my family who serve as primary interviewees and really primary subjects for that book. So I'm moving between familial history, cultural history, social history, kind of all at once. So in that instance, I felt that to ignore and deny the depth of that experience would have been unacceptable to me as a historian, would have been even dishonest in a strange way. I write about, I guess I'm paraphrasing the paper at this point, but I write about a colleague of mine at North Central who's in sociology and also writes history. Lou Corsina, who wrote a book a few years ago called The Neighborhood Outfit. And he writes about the mob in Chicago Heights. And Chicago Heights is the area that Lou and his family, that's their roots, their kind of ancestral homeland in Chicago. His family was a part of, if I have my history straight, the mob in Chicago Heights. Now, Lou was telling me years ago that when he first started writing this book, he didn't include substantially his own family history. And in that classic, revise, resubmit, revise, resubmit, revise, resubmit process, the publisher, an academic at University Press publisher, ultimately asked him to include his familial history. That they felt that it was a mistake, not considering the visceral way in which his family was involved with the subject matter. So I felt in The Midwest Farmer's Daughter that I really needed to include familial history and also community history. Another one that I have also as well is the most recent book called Wish You Were Here, and it's subtitled Love and Longing in an American Heartland. And that's a book that I would have alternately titled Young at Heartland. It's really a history of love and longing and also brain drain as it happens in the Midwest. Now there again, I felt that to not include my own experience and the experience of my family members would have been injudicious, in part because I have lived the brain drain in very poignant ways, and in this case resisted it, refused to lead, refused to be part of the out-migrating brains. I don't know if anybody at home would consider me necessarily a brain, but at least I have a little bit of education, so in that way I guess I would qualify that. Because I and my age peers have so much grappled with that. And because after getting my education I came back and stayed back, I thought that again it would be not wise not to include my own experience. So that's really the core of the issue that I'm meaning to talk about here. And I guess I'll just read a little bit, and Scott, make sure that you don't let me go too long here. So some of this is going to seem like a simplistic illustration, but I'm kind of using it for effect. What I mean to get at is that I think that as regionalists, if we accept that mantle, we are people who believe in, remember Steve Martin, this is going to date me, but in the late 1970s he had an album, back when comedians produced albums, called Think Small. And I think he was using it in a slightly different way than I'm using it, but I think that regionalists characteristically think small. In other words, we're a little bit impatient, I think, for good reason, with global or transnational histories. And we like to sort of filter down the layers and the levels, often going down to region and state, and sometimes even to community. So one of the reasons that I love to come to this conference is if you look at the panelists and the programs from this morning, it's wonderful because so many of them are at a state level or quote unquote small. So I guess the question I'm trying to pose here, I mean there's some great, so I'm just going to read some random titles here. Women's Suffrage and Civic Responsibility in the Midwest, South Dakota, 1914. That's relatively small. Exploring Michigan's role in the city management movement. That's relatively small. And so forth. And we have everything from Latino communities in civil rights era Milwaukee. That's quite small. So I think what defines us as a group is our love of, and in some ways insistence on, the micro, the truly local. So by extension, I argue here that what would be the next layers down in terms of getting small from the regional? Because clearly the regional is still an abstraction, and it's kind of a detail obscuring, nuance obscuring abstraction. We can't even agree, most of us, on what the Midwest is, what defines it, where its boundaries are. We heard in a paper this morning that it has fuzzy boundaries, and that's one reason why Drew Caton called it an anti-region. So even that, the thing that brings us here, is itself a kind of abstraction. But what's smaller than that? Well, we've already started to see it. One would be state histories. Each of these units of government that we go down, so state, township, county, community, and as we get smaller and smaller and smaller, probably finally down to family history, and maybe even smaller than that in my case in particular, farm history. where we're talking about in many ways, a community unto itself. So a small, our farm in Iowa is about 5 miles from a town of about 1,000 called Mechanicsville, Iowa. But growing up, our affiliation with Mechanicsville, Iowa was relatively loose. It was a world away. It was 5 miles away. Most of what we did, learned, saw, felt, happened on the farm. Now the farm at its height was around 500 acres. But really, I suppose the scene, the setting for much of our family history was in the barnyards themselves, that were trying to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So one of the things that I would have us consider as regionalists is to what degree we have a responsibility to pursue those smallest units of history. Now those are often a little bit harder to publish. They don't often win you society awards. They don't often, have you, feted and honored, and the confetti doesn't rain down. So that's the consequence, of course, of getting small, is that there's some loss of arguably prestige. Anyhow, so a few thoughts on that, and then I'll wrap up. I've worked so hard on this, and now, of course, I've done the classic thing where you talk it out rather than read it out, but maybe that's for the best. So again, the question, what to do when the history you write about is your own. I mean to speak here in favor of histories that are personal, familial, and communal, at the same time that they are regional, national, transnational, or international. So can we have it both ways? In the same manuscript, can we have something that's both incredibly micro-local, almost on family level, without sacrificing the larger lens? That's what I'm after, and I hope that we can do. As regionalists, we make a great show of embracing the micro. Eschewing monolithic histories, we make the local and the micro our calling card and our passion project. And yet, for all the intellectual bravery, we seem afraid to push beyond the regional to the next level of locality and groundedness, what I call personal histories. Well, as an illustration, and again, this is pretty elementary, but as an illustration, consider a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 equals the largest or widest global histories, and 1 equals the smallest or narrowest units of local history. As regionalists, most of us exist quite comfortably at around a 3, I would say, right? Where 1 is very local and micro, 10 is global and transnational. I would put regionalists at about a 3 on that scale. My mom was always big. Everything for her had to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. So here it is. Regionalism is a 3, I imagine. We prefer our histories less corporate, less monolithic, more intimate. But if we regionalists stake our claim and stand our ground on history's best class, a 3, say, on a 10-point scale of locality and immediacy, why would we not push inexorably toward a 1 or a 0? Why are we not disgruntled and impatient with the abstraction offered by region as a nuance obscuring lens and label? If we regionalists really and truly believe in the small, the intimate, and the familiar as part and parcel of our scholarly and personal creed, why do we fail to include in our scholarship the 1s or 2s on that scale of locality and intimacy? Those personal, familial, and home community histories that both sustain and explain us. So for all the fascinating history that I've heard today, I've heard virtually no family history. I've heard virtually no home community history. I'd like to argue today that it's not only possible but advisable for a true regionalist historian to move back and forth between personal histories and larger cultural narratives. In arguing for the honesty and beauty of the microcosm, of applying one's historical interest first and foremost to that which is immediately around them in innermost orbit, we stand on the sturdiest and most central plank in the original regionalist platform. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. A bit. Okay, so I guess I'll sort of conclude, and I guess we'll always come back to these topics anyway, with an example I was researching lately where I went to, just for another purpose, I happened to be on the website of the flagship university in my home state. And I happen to be on their history department webpage. And remember, the University of Iowa was the seedbed for regionalist thought in the 1930s in particular. Nowhere was more important or more central. And yet, as I read through, kind of coincidentally, the course listings at the flagship university, I found that regionalism had virtually no presence, and certainly farms and agriculture, which is my passion, among others, had very little presence. And I wanted to kind of read a brief narrative to close on that. Well, I write here as a provocation, I suppose, that in the eyes of the Academy, the regionalist is viewed as a quaint primitivist, and when his own local and regional histories begin with his innermost orbit, family, community, family, profession, in their eyes, that regionalist has gone rogue. At the wedding of sanctioned globalist history with academic orthodoxy, where do we see the orphaned regionalist? Does he belong with the party of the groom or the bride? Such sentiments may sound like a neo-regionalist sour grapes. After all, we counter, pointing at one another as prima facie evidence, isn't a confabulation like ours evidence of a full-on resurgence of a long-dormant creed? And yet the numbers caution against our irrational exuberance. Consider the case of my home state's flagship university, the national hotbed of regionalism in the 1930s. There, in America's most iconic agricultural state, farms or agriculture barely register in the history department, receiving just 5 total mentions in the course descriptions crafted by an otherwise illustrious group of historians. Incidentally, 5 mentions of farm, any variant of the word farm or agriculture, in 19,000 words of course descriptions. I thought I had to double check my math because I thought 19,000 words of course descriptions, and then I went back and I did a word count on my own syllabi, and it's totaled something like 5,000, and so I thought, oh, that's possible, right? So at the University of Iowa, 250 courses, give or take, roughly, generating those course descriptions alone, 19,000 words, thereabouts. Of those words, only, by my count, control F, of farms, farming, farmers, and agriculture and their word variants, only 5 of those 19,000 words in Iowa in those course descriptions. That equals 0.0001% of the approximately 19,000 words deployed to describe the nearly 250 history courses on the books. And then I decided, well, I should put the course descriptions into a word cloud. I'm just learning about word clouds in the past few years, so I won't presume you necessarily know what those are, but of course they visually symbolize, via the size of the word, how many times it occurs in any given text. Transformed into a word cloud, the 19,000 words form a mosaic wherein, beyond the word historical, the largest and most prominent words visually are war, social, political, readings, and century. Now there's really nothing regionalist at all about any of those words. Unbelievably, each of these words looms larger in the word cloud than the single word America. The word America, in turn, appears smaller in the word cloud than the adjective African, strangely enough. Quite frankly, the news isn't good for those of us who believe our taxpayer-funded public universities have a responsibility to teach in depth the histories of their host states and regions. For example, the name of my home state of 7 generations appears only 4 times among the history department's course titles and descriptions. 4 times. For comparison's sake, Asia as a word appears 27 times among the 19,000 words. Europe and its variants 63 times. So, more than 12 times the amount that Iowa appears. Of the nearly 250 courses listed, only 2 have anything expressly to do with the host state of that university. And yet, if asked, many in the university's stable of impressive historical scholars would give lip service to regionalism, to the land-grant mission, and to regional and community engagement. and yet the courses they craft and the words they use to describe their content say otherwise. As the above example all too painfully illustrates, we localists and regionalists, though fringe groups like Occupy Wall Street won better, we're not just 1%ers, we're the 0.0001%ers. But when we research and write histories of self, family, community, township, and state, leavened by and complicated by larger macro histories, larger macro historical narratives, we do regionalism's real work by participating in the movement's original act of resistance.
Thank you, Zachary. The final presentation of this panel is titled, "This is Not Wobegon, Rural Identity and Robert and Nell Peters." The author is Patricia Stoney, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. Dr. Stoney earned her PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her primary area of research is the history of education, in particular Midwestern rural schools and small-town high schools.
I have the honor of teaching the Wisconsin History course at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, and I'm very sincere in saying that. My first degree was in elementary education, and I had always wanted to teach fourth grade, particularly because that's where Wisconsin history is taught. Long story short, I left the public schools, I got my master's degree, my PhD, and now I'm teaching Wisconsin history. When I took over the course from the previous person, he gave me all of his Wisconsin-related books, of which two were, not good at this, of which two were Crunching Gravel, A Wisconsin Boyhood in the 30s by Robert Peters, and then Nell's Story, A Woman from Eagle River by Nell Peters with Robert Peters. Nell and Robert are siblings. Robert is the oldest. In the picture, in the image there on Nell's Story, her cover, he's the boy covering his eyes there. Robert is the oldest, and Nell, sitting on mother's lap there, during the 1930s, is the youngest. Robert was born in 1924. His memoir, published in 1988, covers 1 year in his life, 1935 to 1936, when he was 11 and 12 years old. Nell is born in 1932, and her memoir covers her childhood up through 1995. Nell is the second youngest in the family. The Peters siblings are on the far side. I'll go to Nell's picture there again. On the far side, that is Marjorie, the oldest daughter, and then that is Everett, mother. Nell is sitting on mother's lap and then Robert. Okay. The last child, James, was born until 1940. During Robert and Nell's youth, the family, so mother, father, and the kids, all lived outside of Eagle River, Wisconsin. So they lived in rural Eagle River. And for those of you who are unsure about this, to find Eagle River, you imagine a highway going basically through the center of the state, keep heading north, and it is in Vilas County at the very top there. Okay. Very rural and in the heart of Wisconsin's cutover region. So, Wisconsin history and the Peters memoirs, what's my connection here? Well, I always start my semester by asking my class for words that they think describe Wisconsin and or Wisconsinites. And I found that my students' responses follow a number of stereotypes, after Packers. I get, this white, European, immigrant, homogeneous sort of list of words. No Yankee immigration is mentioned. Nobody comes to Wisconsin from New York or Ohio. Okay. Nothing about the African American diaspora, into the diaspora, sorry about that, into the southeastern part of the state. No Native Americans. We're also rural farmers, dairy farmers. We're skilled, we're hardy, we're independent. Rarely is industry mentioned, other than here. We're classless. That is something that comes up a lot. We're not rich, but we are certainly not poor dirt farmers or laborers. And we're nice, non-judgmental, and we help each other out. The Peters memoirs challenge a number of these stereotypes. Peters are white. As you can see, their heritage is German, English, Irish ancestry there. But they come to Wisconsin from North Dakota. So they're a little bit what Brandon was talking about there. Okay? Eagle River is in Ojibwe country. Okay? So a number of their neighbors come from the Lac du Flambeau Indian Reservation. They are Lac du Flambeau. And they have a lot of contact with Native Americans. They're farmers. Peters farmed, but they were not full-time farmers. Very typical of northern farmers, by the way. Father was a father considered himself a mechanic first, a farmer second, and then I will add a welfare recipient third. Despite farming, despite working odd jobs, many jobs, the family always had to rely on state and federal government subsidies to survive. This idea of classlessness, Robert and Nell are quite aware that they are poor. But they also knew very well that there were people poorer than them in their neighborhood, and they knew how to identify that class status. This is the issue I would like to focus on here today, in particular this notion of worthy and unworthy poor. As children, Robert and Nell had internalized the American belief that poverty reflected a world failing. And their struggle with this, I argue, comes through in their memoirs, in the way they presented their lives and judged the lives of those around them. Theirs is a Wisconsin story. But it is an uncomfortable one because it shows a side of the state that many would prefer to ignore. So, there have always been poor, and probably for just as long the poor have been divided into two groups: the worthy, those who deserve assistance, and the unworthy, those not withheld. In Wisconsin, prior to any kind of welfare state, assisting the poor was really a local function. It was done by the county or the local or at the community level. And it was also considered short-term need. Help was given to those to help them get through a rough patch, an illness or an injury that didn't let the mother or the father work. You might give food, you might give clothing, you might give a little bit of money. Poor farms existed, of course, every county had one, but once again, the expectation was serving this short-term need. Whether or not help was given was determined by county commissioners, and they then looked at a number of different factors. For example, was the recipient temperate or intemperate? What about their sexual behavior? Were they promiscuous? Were they itinerant? Communities were more willing to take care of their own, even when their own were flawed. Louis Atherton in Main Street on the Middle Border defined small towns in part by their ability to identify outsiders. Simply being one of us, therefore, improved your chances of being helped. I go to the Andy Griffith show with this huge all the time. So, if you remember, the Andy Griffith show from the 1960s, or if you've seen the reruns, Otis is the town drunk. He's their town drunk. So, can't be. It's the doily that's in the jail cell for him. Barney is incompetent, but they kept him on the job. So serving the poor statewide, if we look at it, we go to focusing on children, and in particular children's education. Because by the late 1800s, children by definition were really poor. I'll put Pennsylvania in the Midwest for a moment here. And Pennsylvania provides a very good example of this. In 1863, the governor secures funding to open a school for white children of fallen Civil War soldiers. It served orphaned children or half-orphaned children. But the focus was serving children and families who, through no fault of their own, had fallen onto rough times. Wisconsin follows on the heels of Michigan, then, who does a similar thing. They focus on the needs of children through education. And in 1886, Wisconsin opens what's called the Wisconsin Public School. It's located in Sparta, Wisconsin, which is over by the Mississippi River on the southwestern corner of the state. And it served the children of indigent parents. It served orphaned children, half-orphaned children, and it also sometimes served those children who both parents were alive. The children were not naughty. They weren't learning impaired or any other way you could label them. Their only guilt was that they were born. If we move into the Depression then, a lot of these attitudes linger on. Some people deserved help. Orphans deserved help. Elderly widows, they deserved help. But yet again, there were undeserving poor. There were lazy people. There were drinkers. There were the profligate. If any of you are familiar with Robert McElvain's Down and Out in the Great Depression, Letters from the Forgotten Man, these letters show beautifully these attitudes and how they have lingered into the 1930s. I will read a selection out of a letter from a woman in 1936. She's an idol. Dear Mrs. Roosevelt, I am coming to you for help. Please do not think this does not cause a great feeling of shame for me to have to ask for old clothing. I am a Lutheran Sunday school teacher. We are very poor. I don't care for swell clothes, but you know one feels awful in old clothes, worn shiny and threadbare. I think your clothes would fit me by your picture. Please do not think me unworthy. I am so badly in need of a summer coat, and underthings and dresses. Oh, don't think that this is not an effort for me to ask you. Please send me anything you may have on hand in that line, which you do not care to wear yourself. Not a great lot, only a few. I never thought that the time would come when I would find this necessary. Oh, please help me. If you think me unworthy, don't send anything, but think hard to put yourself in my place. I am a mother. I haven't had a new coat in 16 years. Please don't think me unworthy. In many ways, I would argue that Robert and Nell's memoir also can be read as them making the case for their family of being really poor. They're hardworking. The father, he works constantly to bring money or food home to the family. The mother is chained to that kitchen. Okay, she cans, she bakes, all with no electricity or indoor plumbing. She also gardens, by the way, and has 30 chickens. The children work beside the family because survival was the family's business. You know, when father is stripping the bark off the logs for the Wisconsin-Michigan Lumber Company, Robert is by his side stripping logs as well. When father is spear fishing, Robert is picking up the fish that have been tossed along on the shoreline and putting them to back. Robert and Nell both help deliver welfare supplies. Father drives the WPA truck, dropping off these welfare supplies all around Vilas County. Nell scavenges with father for metal in the dump, and all of the kids collect berries when it's berry time. But if we read these memoirs, and Robert's memoir in particular, we see that he sets his family in contrast to some of the neighboring families, the Jollies, for example. The Jollies had 10 children. Okay? Mrs. Jolly, to quote Robert, wore the same dress for months until it turned to shreds. The family slept in 3 beds. Only the parents used silverware at mealtime. The children, quote Robert again, ate with their fingers, and to help yourself to food, you simply reached into the roaster and then wiped your fingers on something. So behavior determined a hierarchical structure, but race did as well. You know, Native Americans as a group ranked below whites. We were not as impoverished as they. We were sure we bathed more, drank less alcohol, avoided knife fights, and rarely beat our wives, said Robert. This is Nell talking. We felt superior to Indians. It was in the air, right? We breathed it. But there were levels within this as well. Any white men who married into a Native American tribe, they became white squaws. Oh, I'm sorry. No, they became squaw men. Okay. But the lowest was, and this is Nell talking, Indians who lived like whites. Scattered among, they were outcasts in both worlds. And because of that, they were, quote, scattered among white communities, pathetic and even more tragic. If we go on continuing with the support that Robert and Nell are making for their family as worthy poor, we can also see them making an argument that their family is not wasteful. Nothing was wasted. The 50-pound welfare flour sacks became dresses, they became skirts, they became sheets, towels, and handkerchiefs. Okay? Old wooden thread spools, the empty thread spools, those were the knobs on their kitchen cupboards. And bacon grease was added to the county welfare peanut butter to extend it and give it a, quote, delicious, salty, smoky flavor loaded with calories and cholesterol. Mother never touches alcohol in either way. And father, the only statement said is that all of his life he downed baking soda and drunk much beer. Yet, throughout both memoirs, drunks and death due to alcohol are relevant. Okay? When young lovers plunge into the ice because their car has skidded off the road, the first question asked was the driver a drinker? Robert and one of the Jolly Boys come across a neighbor, Lars the Swede, frozen on his front porch. And the two boys immediately conclude that Lars, who was, quote, a heavy boozer, must have come home drunk, found the door locked, fallen asleep sitting on the front porch in the snow, waiting for his housemaid Carl. Even the doctor who delivered Everett was believed to have been drunk at the time of the delivery. Still, saying all of this, the family fell short. Father poached. He fished out of season and ignored all other fishing regulations. He stole from one of his WPA jobs. To quote Robert, Dad's trustworthiness and honor were tarnished by a feeling he shared with others of his subculture. Whenever you could exploit the haves or the government, you did. Robert stole from one of his first jobs. While working at a grocery store, he took cakes, soft drinks, and packages of lunch meat and hid it hiding in the basement among stored boxes of food at great feasts. But it is Nell who ticks off most of the boxes to land her in the column of no. She's sexually promiscuous, or so many would probably relate with her. She had 6 children altogether, but 2 of them, twins, were out of wedlock. She was divorced and bisexual. She was an alcoholic. She worked her entire life, yet, throughout her life, she worked a range of seasonal and low-paying jobs. Yet, like her parents, she always had to depend on government subsidies and knowingly punched the system, what she called for taking every advantage that you can in the system. Now, my point in all of this is not to decide whether Robert and Nell and their family were worthy poor or not, because, in fact, Nell can speak for herself. Nell feels she is deserving poor. She says so clearly. She is active within her community. She, at the time of the book, is in her 60s, living in Eagle River, as it says. And she is active within the community. She has leadership roles in the Disabled American Vets Group and the Lions Club. She is disabled herself due to spinal issues that kind of pushed her out of the job market by about age 48, and so she works at home repairing small electrical items because, as she says, the poor cannot afford to buy new, and so you have to rely on people who can do repairs for the poor. She can do that, so that's what she does. She also has a garage sale that runs all summer, and when she sees people who are clearly poor come to her garage sale, she will sometimes give things away. When she sees rich, she jacks the prices up. But I will let Nell, again, speak for herself in some of her attitudes on what I have been talking about. And there are 2 very starkly different ideas here. So once again, both of these are Nell speaking. We survived by learning how to milk the system. Shortcuts are an important part of surviving in the North Woods. And then also, I've always needed to be useful. It's like crossing a desert where you're about to die of thirst, and you find a goat skin full of sweet water. You don't drink it all. And once you've drunk, you fill that skin again at the next oasis for another thirsty trip.
We have time. We have about half an hour for questions.
Well, I think all three papers are very, very interesting. I have a question for Brandon. Actually, two questions. One of the things I've been wondering about was, Wesley, had he ever farmed before? I mean, he has these plans about, oh, I'm going to have a herd of cattle and I'm going to grow a crop by tomorrow to feed them. And I mean, had he ever farmed before? I mean, did he have any idea what kind of farm?
So his father had a farm, his grandpa farmed in New Hampshire. So he grew up on a farm, but he moved west and it's a very different agricultural experience. So he was reading all these reports coming out of the Dakota Territory about how great the land was, about if you did it right, how much money you can make, and of course they were exaggerated to some extent. So he's really buying into this, that if he just went and got land there, he could take what he knew from New Hampshire, just magnify that to whatever extent, and he was going to be set because that was the best land. He was going to be able to do it. And he was just not aware of the limitations of the environment. He was just so overly optimistic, and he really bought into those exaggerated reports. So he had experience, he knew what it would take, but he thought that the environment would really help him out.
And Brendan, how old was he when you first went out to the Dakotas?
Oh, that's a good question. He was mid-30s.
Okay.
My comment, I want to say that they're all great papers. Thank you. For Jack. I would, in your hierarchy of 3s, 2s, and 1s, I would like to put a 1 as an event.
As a what?
An event.
Okay, okay.
As the smallest microcosm.
Oh, right, that's interesting.
To blow it up and the other way and make it global. I'm all about Michigan local history, and I'm all about the county that I grew up in, and I work for the State Museum, so I'm all about whenever we do anything, I say, you can't do Michigan history without Lenawee County. You can't. And they all go poo-poo, but I turn out to be right everything. And in the strangest ways. But growing up in a very small local community of about 50 people here in the state, we had a horrific event occur in this neighborhood in 1901. It was a fiery train wreck. And in that train wreck were killed 100 Italian immigrants. And those immigrants were swept under the rug literally by the railroad. They wanted no recognition at all that these people ever existed. And so about 15 years ago, I documented this event, and I thought it was all local until I started reading papers. I had a mentor who said, no, you haven't read the Chicago Tribune. What does it say? Front page of the Chicago Tribune. I thought, really?
Yeah.
It's in the San Francisco newspaper. It's in the London Times. And just recently, I've connected with a group of Italians in Italy who have family who they think were in this wreck. And they're now doing genealogy to come back to find them. And they read to me in Italian the newspaper account that went back to these villages just 2 days after this event, saying there's been this wreck in this little tiny town in Michigan, and you should know. And the whole thing has been kind of surreal and exciting and challenging all at once. And it's what I love about local history. It's where I think where we fit in doing regionalism. But I would be down to the event.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Find
I like
something that can grow. And I had no idea when I did this how it would grow and touch global issues, world issues, immigration. How do we feel about immigrants today? How do we feel about immigrants then? And back and forth. And the result of all this has been to have known Italian artists put a grave marker on the unmarked graves of these Italians in a local cemetery. And so it's just morphed into all sorts of things. But that's what I love about history. And thank you for sharing your interest in it and reminding us that that's really the core of when we do history. All things are global. And no matter what scale you're at, what number you are on the scale, that's really it. So.
Well, yeah, and you know, and Michael today, and Michael Steiner, in his talk, said he reminded us that everything is placed.
Yeah.
You know, quite literally, everything takes place,
Right.
as you said, and that's a great example. What was the name of the town of 50?
Sand Creek, Michigan.
Sand Creek, Michigan.
Yeah, it's on the Ohio border. You can see Ohio.
Okay, okay, yeah.
Where
That's a great example.
Yeah.
I have a very fitting quotation. I think it will work if I can come up with it. But
Okay.
it comes from a book by William Leaf Teague Moon called Blue Highways.
Oh, okay.
And he's in this little town of 9 Box, Texas, with like 20 people. And someone says to him, nothing important happens in 9 Box unless you call babies and crying and dying. So, you know, I mean, that's where it happens.
Yeah.
It's better than what I just remembered.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
everything happens.
And it's hard because when I was working on my dissertation at MSU, I could see the small community of agriculture drifting away, and I wanted to document that, and I was pushed in a whole other direction.
That often happens.
And I fought like crazy, and they would not believe me that this was worth it, but I persisted. So come hear my presentation.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. In fact, I've got a bit in here about that oftentimes our mentors are, they want to help in those ways, dissertation directors, thesis directors, and so forth, but they doing what they think is their fiduciary duty, they point us more in the direction of those national, global histories, and often the personal connections we have to that history do get bracketed into kind of more whimsical preface material. In other words, that thing that you feel so viscerally that your family has experienced, for example, ends up being a short bit of 300 words in the preface.
Yeah.
But one of the things that fascinates me, my great-grandfather was a farmer, a dirt farmer in Iowa, but he was also a writer. He published one book that was called The Furrow in Us. And it's still occasionally studied. It did pretty well. It ended up in the National Agricultural Library and the Cornell Core Library of Agriculture, all those things. But what fascinates me as a teenager, I kind of, no one in my family talked about that book. It just sat on the shelf. You'd think that we would be proud of it, but for whatever reason we weren't. So one night I got bored and I was trying to sleep and pulled it down off the shelf. But at 13, a lot of what he was talking about, some of it was soil science. What I was completely missed upon me because I hadn't done a lot of farming myself at that point, so it was all esoteric. But there were passages in that book, and they're a minority in that book, but to this day, I think what rings truest about The Furrow in Us, and what I think will stand up, will give that book the most longevity, is when it is the most personal. When he is writing about his Quakerism, he was a Quaker. When he was writing about the Quaker land ethic, when he's writing about how called he feels to Iowa, he writes, "My place is under Iowa skies," and then he goes on from there and waxes poetic in a way that still registers with me. And I think that I sometimes console myself when I choose to include these personal community familial histories, that someday someone is going to want to know more than our mind. They're going to want to know more than our academic subject matter. And hopefully we'll have something for them. And that's something that dissertation directors and thesis directors, first readers, don't always think about. So, and they're often more globalist and cosmopolitan in orientation anyway, because they have managed to rise to the position that they have. So.
I actually have two questions, but I can kind of spread them out so everybody can ask others if they want to. The first relating to what we've been saying how do you, I work with a lot of other local historians and patrons and some genealogists as well. Some of them are actually very good researchers. But how do you kind of encourage them when they want to research and write to be, to not lose their regionalism and their localism and their personal interest and subject, but also to be a little more rigorous,
Right,
a little
right.
more, you know,
Sure.
some of them have wonderful knowledge, but you want them to also be able to put it in a larger context and be a little more macro about it. So how do you kind of, just kind of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and probably other people in this room might have a better sense, you know, for that than I might. But I think a lot of it goes back to, and this is I think also true of our students, say as writers. What is their goal with the history that they're conducting? And I think sometimes to start there, because if they are a person who aspires to publish that work with a major publisher, say, or an academic press or whatever, they're invariably going to be asked to introduce some of the same theoretical, methodological rigor that you're describing. However, if their goal is strictly genealogical and they hope to take that research back to their own families, spread it amongst the family, sometimes all that methodological overlay I think can be more than they want, more than they need, off-putting. So I guess the key probably, and I suppose this is true of like the scholars and the writers we work with, you know, as undergrads and so forth, is to determine, and sometimes they don't know, and they haven't seen the full possibilities, but what is their end goal? What do they want? And then if there's a disconnect between what they want and the tools that they have to achieve that thing, then I think that's where, you know, you or we can come in and help give them those tools. But I think sometimes when it's like so many things, when we project our own agendas and ideologies and need for whatever it might be, scholarly attention onto them, that's when you run afoul of, and sometimes that can turn people away from historical study. Witness all the people who enroll in a history graduate program and ultimately decide, you know, geez, this isn't quite what I thought it was. It's not as whatever fun or passionate or so anyhow, I don't know if that's useful.
It is, actually. I wrote a couple things down. I have kind of a somewhat selfish purpose sometimes because it's like I can't write research and write everything, so if I can get other people you know, research and write, it can improve you know, the whole historical record, and maybe as an archivist, which I am, I can collect some of their things to improve my collection, so that's part of my, I don't know if you call that selfish, but that's part of it. But yeah, you did make a couple of really good.
I think that's perfect, because that's essentially, you know, learning on the job. That's sort of experiential training that you're giving them, and that's probably ideal. You know, if they have the interest in serving in that way, then it's both symbiotic. They're learning more sophisticated methods, and you're getting a better, in theory, a better quality product. And a lot of the things that they would learn in that experience, they can then apply to their own passion projects, I think, in ways that they never would have thought to, you know, otherwise. So
yeah, I think the determining their goal first is a really good suggestion. Thank you.
My last name is Minima, and I learned several years ago that that means the son of Menno. So I decided to write a paper about Menno Simons in the 16th century.
okay.
And I found a wonderful guy who was a Menno scholar to advise me and help me with the paper. But so I included in the paper the fact that I was a descendant of Menno. When he went to revise it, he struck that out. He didn't know that.
Sure.
And yet, the whole experience of writing the paper was different because I wanted to know who I was and who I came from, and I learned a great deal about that. The motivation was incredible for understanding, and I think I also brought some insight from my character as a member of that family into the writing of the paper. So
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting point. And then the second point I want to make, the person that best illustrates to me what you're talking about, who's done this beautifully and well is James Carroll. I don't know if you've read any of Carroll's books, but he has written Constantine's Sword on the history of Catholics and Jews.
Okay.
He himself speaks from his own Catholic tradition. And he's written another wonderful book, The House of War, on the history of the Pentagon, and he writes out his own history. His dad worked with the Pentagon all during the Vietnam War. He really knows how to weave the story together from his own experience and the larger narrative. Well,
Yeah, no, those are great recommendations. That sounds perfect. And so, say something more about your process, though. What did you end up learning in terms of the connections you had as the son of?
Well, Menno Simons was called to be a preacher after being the son of a Fries dairy farmer. And I was called to be a preacher after being the son of a Fries dairy farmer.
Right.
So we had a great deal to learn from each other. But I could say too much more about that, and I won't. But it was a great experience.
So I'm coming at this not being a historian, I'm an engineer, and I teach at Grand Valley, and I have come to enjoy history because I had a chance to co-teach a class with a history professor here at Grand Valley and learned a whole different way of scholarship. But I have always enjoyed reading historical novels, especially maybe not even a novel that is written based on memoirs of someone else. So this is, for me, not being a history person, my pathway into history is reading these kinds of stories about real people who I can identify with. You know, I read the story of General Lee's wife at the time of the Civil War. So I'm really interested in what happened in the Civil War in the United States, and so in that perspective, to read something from her perspective on the Civil War, that this is my way of learning history, because I will tell you the truth. As a kid coming up through grade school and high school and so on, I hated history. It was all just dates and stuff, and that meant nothing to me. But when you get it from personal history and it begins to grow that, I have taken a lot of history that I have learned about the city of Grand Rapids by having co-taught with someone who knows a lot about the city of Grand Rapids, and I've injected into my engineering classes. So thermodynamics students are finding out about, oh yeah, Grand Rapids used to have a water system that was all gravity driven, and they decided after the Great Fire in 1872 that they should have pressurized water. This lends a dimension to the current study, because engineering is one of those things that always thinks forward and very seldom thinks backward. So I just wanted to comment on that, because your comment about taking a history at the most personal level, that's an entry point for a lot of people that are outside of the field of history.
It is, and I like your word of gateway, because I always point out, you know, at a time when enrollments in undergraduate history programs are going down quite dramatically, and so are the number of majors nationwide that history generates. Meanwhile, though, you have the success of like Ancestry.com, right, which has, you know, I think this is a current figure, about 2.5 million active online subscribers. That's almost 1 million more than the number of digital subscribers that the New York Times has, for example. So, you know, and also I was thinking about this and looking at this, it's actually almost as many as, you know, the online dating service Match. It's almost as many as that. So, you know, when people bemoan the lack of subscription of history majors, and the number, I want to say, well, maybe it's because we're not doing something right. Maybe we're not finding the right gateway. Maybe if we give people the right gateway, they walk through the gate. So I like the way you put that.
What is the course that you teach with a historian?
I taught with Matthew Daly, and we taught a class on urban. So the history side and the engineering side.
talking about and this kind of intersects with what we just were talking about, but you were talking about this concept of the worthy poor and the unworthy poor, and how that plays out in the Peter's memoirs. And that's, of course, not a concept that's unique to northern Wisconsin, even in Europe, the Industrial Revolution. So I guess I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about how this relates to Midwestern identity? I think you kind of presented this as sort of a challenge to stereotypical ideas about Midwestern identity. And I'm asking this as I'm not really a Midwest historian, even though my topic was related to that. I just kind of stumbled into that. So can you help me understand more broadly what is Midwestern identity and how that works against that idea of worthy and unworthy, what works against that?
Well, I guess one of the things that I would say is that Midwestern identity has the sense that it is independent of any kind of help. And so that's clearly disregarding any kind of government work that has been done in terms of setting up, early on setting up forts where, the Indians traded, and so they became dependent on trade goods, platting land, creating, a situation where farmers received tax breaks. All of this was kind of an under the radar sort of thing. And yet, when we look at what's going on with Peters, their sense of dependence is obvious. And it's obvious within the whole neighborhood as well. So their neighbors are dependent also. And I guess what I would bring it back to again is the notion of, perhaps that question of why is it that they need to have, support from the government in order to survive? That personal question of what might I be doing wrong? Especially if you look back at your region and you think about your region as being made up of people who did not need that kind of help. It was there, but it was in a different form, perhaps not as obvious. And yet they are unable to survive without any kind of help. That's how I would see it.
So this is a question for all three of you. So as a regionalist, I have become increasingly suspicious of regional narratives. Because I find that like in the case of what is Midwestern, if it's being completely independent, well, that makes certain stories invisible. So could you speak to the question of, and I hate to mention this as we're trying to bring back Midwest studies, but the Midwest narrative, is there anything dangerous about that? Is it silencing other narratives that we should be careful about?
Who wants to field that?
Well, I was at in the first session. I was at the one which was dealing with Latino and Latina populations within the state. And one of the arguments there was that yes, well, first of all, that they have been around for quite a while, much like was it McDuffie? Was that the last name? Yeah, much like Professor McDuffie said concerning African Americans. Yes, they have been here, but it's been kind of a contested ground as to their relationship in this area. Are they staying? What purpose are they serving? And the other thing that was brought up in that group then was what image are they challenging? So when you have a population of Mexicans, and that was the largest group of the Latinos in like the Green Bay area and such, what is their presence? Who, what does their presence threaten, that already exists? And so that kind of looks at, yes, there, who's telling, the story is going to be a part of that too, I would guess. I guess I drifted a little bit.
Think of the Somali presence in St. Paul and Minneapolis.
Yeah.
You know, just really, like, it's got to be incorporated somehow, really.
In Barron, Wisconsin, I mean, there's a strong Somali presence in Barron, Wisconsin because of because once again of the meat.
The Hmong presence.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a colleague who I mentioned to this week that was coming here, and she said, "Are you covering Latino history? What are are there sessions that are covering?" I said, "Yeah, I looked at the program recently." So she's sensitive to that already.
It's difficult from the standpoint of the Wisconsin history course I teach, because the students really come in not expecting anything along those lines. And if you go to that point of kind of appealing to what they're interested in, the class that I teach is white students.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I'm going to appeal to their backgrounds, they are not. Many of them are not going to be learning Latinos, learning about the Latinos in Milwaukee or Green Bay, or they're not going to be learning a lot about the in lacrosse.
But when I follow up on that, what do your students take from what you present to us? When I assume you present that to them, does that challenge their sort of? How does that work?
Yeah, it does. Well, what I do is I use just Robert's memoir, not Nell's. Nell can be very crude, and I think that my students would leave with nothing other than binge. And so I just use Roberts, and there is a scene in here, for example, when his mother has a miscarriage. He's in the living room, his mother is having a miscarriage in the bedroom. The doctor comes in, our father comes out with the baby wrapped in newspaper, goes and buries the baby. The doctor comes and deals with mother. And in parting, the doctor says to Robert, taps him on the shoulder and says, "You didn't need your family didn't need any more mouths to feed anyway." So that is something that really strikes my students as something that, oh my gosh, this sort of attitude, this is a Wisconsin story. And I pair it with a story that is a much more typical southwestern farm, Wisconsin story, middle class and such. And many of my students, at the end of the semester, I will ask them, so what struck you the most? And many times it will be, crunching gravel, because it's a side of Wisconsin history, and it's a side of that farm story that they've just never heard before. And there's some, and Robert Peters is a beautiful writer as well, and so the way he can present things to start clearly strikes them.
It's a tough, it's a really good question. One question, one answer could be that ultimately and this is not an adequate answer, but that in some ways, we all know the flawed logic in this, but that the market determines. In other words, if what we have is one person piling on top of another person's scholarship on top of another on top of another, we have this homogeneity. Ultimately, I think scholars, readers, textbook editors, et cetera, all get very impatient with that, right? Because it's just more of the same. And I think that the program, is good evidence. I think that the program is more diverse and eclectic in finding the Lost Region 3, I think, than it was, in my estimation, from Lost Region 1. So I think just this innate sense we have of audience, and the people who help put this scholarship into publication, I think that all has its own sort of logic, and I think that that's moving in a good direction. One of the things that always concerns me, and it's pretty shocking when you hear it, and you do hear it, is from somebody with an agricultural background. There are many university presses now in the Midwest that aren't really interested in agricultural narratives. Because, as we all know, you'd think that would be the one place, in the nation that would be. But what is it, less than 1.5% of the American workforce now is agricultural. It's becoming very rapidly a minority view in an extreme way. but not in a way that many people acknowledge. And so the flip side of that is agricultural narrative in a traditional sense may not sell very well, but that doesn't mean that university presses here shouldn't be actively seeking it and publishing it for the very reason that that's their, the university press mission was always not to choose work that sells well, but to choose work that represents an underrepresented, view in some sense. So sometimes that underrepresented actually comes from the stereotype that people have of us as a region. What do you?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that you know that, because the stereotype of the Midwest is agrarian.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear you say that that's actually a minority voice. Do you think that has something to do with the way that the Midwest agrarian narrative has become so dominant that it's hard to get through the layers of actual experience?
Well, I think it has to do with, one of the things I've tried to do because of my belief system is I've tried to, out giving readings and presentations, I will often, if forced to choose a smaller community or a rural community to do that. And because I know that there's a well-trod path that goes to the Lincolns, the Iowa Cities, the Madisons, and there's a wealth of speakers that residents of those communities can go to. There's a wealth of kind of highly literate culture there. So I often will go to the smaller communities, but universally what I find is, of course, is that the book buyers are often not in those smaller rural communities. And so I think that the fact that, say, environmental literature is selling much better and is much more popular in terms of being acquired than agricultural literature is also something, again, to be wary of, simply because agricultural, small towns, agricultural people are not as consumer-minded, or maybe not as well-heeled or as likely to buy the book, doesn't mean that they shouldn't have material that is appropriate for them. A good example of this historically is a period in the 1970s called the Rural Purge. This was with television. And very famously, the CEO of CBS started a trend whereby the networks were cutting rural programming, the rural and western. And they were cutting it almost entirely to the point that I grew up, in my TV watching days were primarily in the 1980s. And by the time the 1980s came around, there was very little that I saw on screen that represented my family and our way of life, almost nothing. And what was there was in reruns. So Hee Haw, was already in syndication. Little House on the Prairie was already getting into syndication. The rationale that the CBS exec's name that I'm blanking on was that rural viewers are not the buyers of the products that our commercials are selling. Therefore, it makes no sense for us to continue to supply this programming to a smaller and smaller demographic who is not acculturated in a culture of purchasing. So there again, I think that the mistake sometimes that publishers make is to, I think if you talk to agricultural writers, if one talks to agricultural writers, one finds that they're finding it very difficult for the same reasons that I've mentioned.
Well, I come across, I'm actually
yes, I know.
And yeah, I would be a little weary of agricultural books, mainly because that's the dominant narrative of the Midwest, whether or not that's accurate or not.
Sure.
But yeah, I would be a little weary of that, I gotta say.
Yeah, I think it might be the dominant narrative historically, but in terms of contemporary, it's certainly not the dominant narrative. And that gets into the points that have been made today about, when you ask students what the stereotype of the region might be, they might think that, that it's rural or that it's whatever it is, but actually the demographics increasingly say otherwise. For example, my home state of Iowa is now, I think, approaching 60% urban. And most people would be shocked to learn that. Most people would be shocked to realize that our major cities largely determine the way that the vote goes in Iowa. would think that it's all, you know, bumpkins that are, you know, that are choosing either Trump or Obama or whomever, and of course demographically that's just not the case. So the Midwest is a place of so many illusions and so many stereotypes and so many that need to be challenged, and I think that's the common ground there. So you know, Patricia, you would be in a much better place to determine this than I would, but if I were editing a press, I would be looking for narratives that challenge stereotypes in important ways, regardless of whether they come from the stereotypical dominant narrative or whether they come from the kind of voices that we've been learning to hear for generations.
And I think that's the exciting part of Midwestern history right now, is there's a lot of opportunity to study these often kind of neglected groups that and challenge these more dominant narratives. So I think there's a lot of room for the field to grow when looking at identity in the Midwest.
Can I just add one thing? I've been involved in a People's Guide movement coming out of the WPA Writers Project, and they're local histories, they're grassroots histories. And I'm involved with the People's Guide to Orange County. So we're kind of modeling ourselves after the Federal Writers Project in Studs Terkel and Howard Zinn. And it's kind of crosses over into a lot of the stuff we're talking about. So there could be a streak of light in this. So look into it, the People's Guides too.
Okay.
And there are probably 4 or 5 of them across the country. So yeah, Studs Terkel, Howard Zinn, you know, bringing together local. It's exciting.
Well, that's probably a good note to end on. We can take things to the reception though, so how about another round for